So we'll start looking at plate tectonics with a scientist named Alfred Wegener. Had the kind of mind that does not neatly fit into any single academic department. He'd actually got his doctoral degree in more or less in astronomy. He was a pioneer in the use of weather balloons. He was one of the first to stick weather instruments onto a balloon and send it up to look at the upper atmosphere. He, I guess if you could call him any one thing, he was a geophysicist. He was also a polar explorer. And in fact, that picture of him was taken in a metal hut on the Greenland ice cap. And in fact, that's where he died. I think on or just before his 50th birthday, I believe. Body never found, by the way. He's still up there on the ice cap, we think. Anyway, he'd been reading about the distribution of animal and plant fossils around the world, and people had noticed for a long time that there was an interesting pattern of similarities and differences in the fossils that you found in different places at the same time. And sometimes it didn't match up with where the continents were now. You know, why would you get radically different fossils on opposite sides of a relatively small island like Newfoundland, for example? Why would you find tropical plants in what are now polar climates? You know, why would you find, fossils of, giant ferns and things like that in places like Antarctica, where they certainly can't grow now? And of course, how did different groups of living things get to the places where they live now? Wegener got interested in all of that, and he proposed that you could explain an awful lot of it if you assume that the continents had been moving. This is sometimes called continental drift. And specifically, roughly 250 million years ago, the Earth's continents were joined together in a single supercontinent that he called Pangaea. Pan is Greek for all. Gaea is Earth, as in geology or geography. So Pangaea is all Earth. Pangaea would have been surrounded by a single great world ocean called Panthalassa. And Pangaea came into existence about 250 million years ago. Before that date, the continents were separate. One of the effects of the fact that the Earth is round, I don't care what that YouTube video said, the Earth is round. And if you have continents moving over the surface of a round Earth, they may spread apart, but if they're spreading apart, eventually they're going to go all the way around and come back together again. So Pangaea may be just the most recent of many, well, not many, but several supercontinents we've had. Anyway, Pangaea began breaking up about 200 million years ago, and the first split was between a northern and a southern half. The northern half consisting of North America, Europe, and most of Asia, which we now call Laurasia, and the southern half consisting of South America, Africa, Antarctica, Australia, India, which used to be a separate little continent of its own, and a few bits and bobs like Madagascar and New Zealand, and we call that Gondwana. And then as time's gone on, not only have Laurasia and Gondwana separated, but both halves have fragmented further, giving rise to the continents that we know today. What was his evidence? These are some leaves of a fern-like plant. It's technically not a fern. It actually produced seeds and may have been closer to flowering plants than anything else, although it was not itself a flowering plant. It's called Glossopteris. The leaves have this very distinct vein pattern. And in the middle, there's some Glossopteris leaves from Australia. I've actually seen I've collected some myself. On the left, that's a Glossopteris from Antarctica, 98% covered by ice, but the 2% that isn't has a perfectly good fossil record. And on the right, one from India. A couple of more fossils. These belong to a group called the synapsids. They're not fully mammals, but they are more closely related to mammals than anything else. They've got some, but not all, mammalian features. Up on the top, Lystrosaurus actually didn't have many teeth except for one pair of tusks. We think it made a living digging, grubbing around for roots and things like that. Down at the bottom, Cynognathus would have been more carnivore-like, and like mammals, it's got a more upright posture, and it's got several different types of teeth instead of all of the teeth being the same type, which is what you'd get in a lizard or a dinosaur. These are about from the same time frame as Glossopteris. This is a funny little reptile. You can see that the body is roughly a foot long. The tail might be another foot. We think this thing swam. It's got paddle-like limbs and was adapted for aquatic life. It's called Mesosaurus. And if you plot where you find these on a map, you get this. Mesosaurus is found in South America and in Southern Africa. And Cynognathus is found in Central South America and Central Africa. Lystrosaurus turns up in Africa and India and also in Antarctica. You know, as I mentioned, the parts of Antarctica that aren't icebound include sedimentary rocks that do have a fossil record. And then Glossopteris is found in all of those southern continents. So you can see these four have these overlapping patterns of distribution. Now, people knew about this, and the common assumption had been that one explanation was dispersal, that, you know, Glossopteris may have had seeds and Glossopteris might have evolved on one of these continents and then the seed just floated. Well, that can happen, but how would that explain Cynognathus and Lystrosaurus, which don't have seeds and which, as far as anybody can tell now, can't swim? Even Mesosaurus was probably not a long distance swimmer. It's not the kind of critter you would expect could swim from South America all the way to Africa today. That's what, 5,000 miles or something like that. There had also been claims that there had once been land bridges connecting the continents. There are some cases where this works. You might know that there used to be solid ground between Siberia and North America, a land bridge that early Native Americans are thought to have walked across, a land bridge called Beringia. There's a few other cases like that. But if you try to explain all of these cases of disjunct distributions with land bridges, the problem is you've got so many land bridges in the ocean that there's no room for the water. And Wegener thought you could explain this if you just tossed out the assumption that the continents had always been right where they'd been put, and in fact had moved over the surface of the earth over extremely long timescales. There were living critters that had the same pattern of distribution. On the left, those are the leaves of a plant called southern beech, Nothofagus. Where it lives today is in parts of eastern and southern Australia, New Zealand, southern South America up in Chile, And there have actually been fossil finds, mostly pollen, found in Australia and in Antarctica. Now, why there? Maybe you could explain that with Nothofagus seeds, evolving on one continent and floating to the other, but it's not going to explain the lungfish. Lungfish are capable of breathing air. In fact, they're dependent on it. They're among the few fish that can actually drown if they don't get access to atmospheric oxygen. And there's a lungfish species in Africa on the left, and Australian lungfish is seen at the upper right, and there's a South American lungfish at the lower right. They're all restricted to fresh waters, and they're not powerful swimmers. If it were tuna we were talking about, those are fast attack predators that can cross an ocean. Lungfish, not so much. These are not critters you would expect to be able to drift from one continent to another. So what are they doing in Africa, Australia, and South America? The same is true for conifers in the family Araucariaceae. The one that's best known around here gets sold as an ornamental plant. It's called Norfolk Island pine. You tend to see it in, the plant section of Bourgeoisie Kroger over on Salem around about Christmas. People like it as a potted Christmas tree. But it's not native here. It's native to, Norfolk Island is off the coast of Australia, and other araucarias are found in Australia, New Zealand, and South America. And they used to be in Antarctica too. There's a family of mud minnows, ratites, birds with a flat breastbone. Here's a flowering plant that's endemic to Gondwana. It's the family Proteaceae. Up there at the top left, Protea is the national flower of South Africa. Down there at the bottom, there's another plant in the same family from Australia. Top right, there's a South American one. And none of these have any members, either living or fossil, to be found in North America, Europe, or Asia. On the other hand, if you want examples of endemics to Laurasia, oaks are almost entirely restricted to Asia, Europe, and North America. So are sequoias, redwoods. We've got California redwoods, the Chinese dawn redwood, and they're extinct in Europe, but fossils show they used to have them there. Bears are also restricted, with one exception that I'll get to pretty late, to North America, Asia, and Europe. And flowering plants in the Cornaceae, which is the dogwood family, are endemic to Laurasia. So our familiar flowering dogwood is up at the top left. There's one just outside the back entrance to Lewis that was really pretty a couple of weeks ago. Up at the top right, that's an Asian species, and bottom right, that's a European species that does not form a big tree, forms a little, marsh-dwelling plant. But that family is unique only to these continents that Wegener thought had once been connected. And again, you could explain any one of these with dispersal, but why should critters as different as dogwoods and bears have the same distribution? Why should critters as different as galaxiid mud minnows and Proteaceae flowers have the same distribution? Wegener also found that if you put the continents back together, not only could you get the outlines to match up, but geologic features would match up. So for example, mountain ranges match up. The Appalachian mountain ranges of eastern North America actually match up with things like the Scottish Highlands. I compare this to, let's say you dropped a plate with a design on it and you had to put the pieces together. You'd soon notice that if you got it right, not only would the edges of the pieces match up, but the designs on the pieces would match up. And, one half of that pretty blue flower on your grandmother's plate would match up with the other half of the pretty blue flower, and so on. So mountain ranges match up. Down there below, you can see some areas that are shaded in gray and labeled GL. That's rock deposits that were of a type that are laid down by glaciers, and those seem to match up. Coal beds, like the Appalachian coal beds and the European coal beds, match up. Up here, up at the top, where it says GY and D, that's gypsum, which is a rock deposit of that's calcium sulfate hydrate that forms in dry conditions, and sandstones laid down in the desert. We have belts of those that match up in North America and in Siberia. So if you put the continents together, not only do the outlines match, but features like mountain ranges, earthquake faults, and rock deposits match up. So there's a closer look at those glacial deposits. When you look at rock layers that were laid down by glaciers, one of the things you can find is called glacial striations, scratch marks on rocks caused by moving ice. And this not only tells you there were glaciers present, but it tells you what direction the glaciers were moving. And so when you put the continents together, not only do the glacial areas match up, the striations are all pointing away from where the South Pole would have been at the time. So this makes sense. If the continents used to be close together, there was a big cold snap in Earth's climate, and ice sheets started forming at the South Pole and then growing away from the South Pole as the ice sheets expanded and the climate got colder and colder and colder. Wegener's ideas didn't get accepted immediately. A lot of his best evidence was in the Southern Hemisphere, and so it wasn't very familiar to most North American and European geologists. They didn't really have a chance to see things like this for themselves. There's also the fact that nobody could figure out how the continents were moving. Wegener's original ideas were that the continents were plowing through the crust at the bottom of the ocean, but somebody worked out that any force that could do that would be strong enough to stop the Earth rotating in less than a year. Since the Earth is still, in fact, rotating, that can't be it. But more evidence started turning up in the aftermath of World War II, when the military started exploring the deep ocean in much more detail. Because if you're going to have a fleet of nuclear submarines, they need to be able to find places to hide, um, and ways to navigate. If you're going through the deep ocean at 500 feet below the surface, there's not a great deal of light. So you need to know what's down there. And there was a great deal of research, a lot of it sponsored directly or indirectly by the US Navy, on exploring the seafloor. This ship, the Glomar Challenger, gathered a great deal of very important evidence for modern plate tectonic theory, although its real purpose was to recover wrecked Soviet submarines and steal their code books, which it did, by the way, we now know. But when it wasn't going after wrecked Soviet subs, the Glomar Challenger, that drilling rig on the deck, drilled down and got samples of deep ocean rocks and sediments, and led to the formation of modern plate tectonic theory. So those of you veterans of marine biology have seen some of this before. This happens to be the western edge of the United States. San Jose, California is right there. So I do know the way to San Jose. Monterey, California is, okay, I can't actually draw on it because I've got a toolbar on top of it, but Monterey is more or less in there. That right there is Monterey Canyon. The current coastline is right here along these dark lines, but the current coastline is not really your best guide because sea level rises and falls. It's rising now because of global climate change, but even before humanity was present, it tends to go up and go down because Earth climate's a very complicated machine. So the place where the waves are breaking has gone up and down in the past. More stable is the continental shelf, and the edge of the continental shelf right here marks the beginning of the continental slope, where the land slopes down to the deeper abyssal plain down here. The continental shelf water depths range between, well, of course, 0 at the shoreline to maybe a few hundred feet. It's relatively flat. And then the continental shelf drops off down the continental slope at maybe a 1 to 2% grade, down to the abyssal plain, which may be many thousands of feet deep, 20,000 feet deep in the middle of the Pacific, for example. And it turns out that if you match up the outlines of the continental shelves, the fit is almost perfect. That's what these blue lines are showing. The coastlines look like you could fit them together, but the fit is not really exact. But when you place the continental shelf edges together, the fit is nearly perfect. There is, somebody actually ran numbers on this. The probability of the continental shelves fitting together as well as they do purely by random chance is something on the order of 1 in a million. I forget the exact number, but there's an extremely small probability that the matchup between continental shelves of separate continents is due to chance. It's virtually certain that it is not. But we've modified our ideas about the mechanism of what's going on. The part of the Earth that we're standing on is called the Earth's crust. And a guy about 100 years ago, 110, from Croatia, I believe, named Andrija Mohorovicic, analyzed the seismic waves that you get from earthquakes and found that, depends on where you are, but on continents, uh, typically between about 20 and 40 miles down, like in the Rockies, 60 miles down. Like I said, it depends on where you are, but on an average of roughly 40 miles down, the type of rock suddenly changes. And that's where we transition from the uppermost layer of Earth, called the crust, to the layer below it, which is called the mantle. The mantle is very dense. It is very hot. And mantle rocks are solid rocks. We're not floating on an ocean of liquid rock. The mantle's solid, but the mantle is under such intense heat and pressure that it actually flows. Yeah, you could think of it as, being something like peanut butter or something like that, which is technically solid, but if you exert a strong enough force on it, like when you're spreading it on bread, you can get it to flow. And we think that all of the Earth's crust literally floats on top of the upper mantle. The upper layer of the mantle, by the way, is called the asthenosphere. Asthenos is Greek for weak, in the sense of not strong. So the asthenosphere is the weak layer. And the asthenosphere, even though it's solid, is capable of flowing under intense heat and pressure. And the crust, both the crust that makes up the continents and the thinner crust that makes up the bottom of the ocean, is being carried on the upper mantle as if it were being carried on a big conveyor belt. There's debate as to exactly what the ultimate driving force is, which I'm not qualified to go into. The leading theory is that it's convection in the asthenosphere. And that both continental crust, the relatively light rocks that make up, well, the continents, and the oceanic crust, which is denser, form plates of rock called tectonic plates. There's about 20 of these. This is a map of where they are. So we're on the North American plate. The North American plate actually includes a part of Russia over here. It's interesting, Iceland is actually split between plates. You could actually walk from the North American plate to the European plate, right across a volcanic valley called Thingvellir, that marks the boundary. Africa is on the African plate, South America on the South American plate. The Pacific Ocean is mostly floored by the Pacific plate. And there's some smaller ones as well, the Arabian plate over here, the Caribbean plate, the Nazca plate. The Galapagos are right where the Nazca plate, the Cocos plate, and the Pacific plate meet. So they're right there, not to scale. There was even at one time a separate plate making up what's now China, although that's joined the Eurasian plate. But China used to have a separate China plate. Get it? China plate? Yeah. Okay, sorry about that. And we can trace the plate margins because these tend to be where a lot of earthquake activity happens. These are the epicenters of earthquakes between 1980 and 1990. I looked at some more recent data, but the picture doesn't change. Most of the Earth's earthquake activity is taking place on plate boundaries. There's a few places where you do get earthquakes outside plate boundaries, like New Madrid, Missouri, and Hawaii, and actually South Carolina, believe it or not, has historically had some big earthquakes. So there's a few that aren't on boundaries, but the vast majority are. This is also where you get the vast majority of volcanic activity along plate boundaries. And again, you do get some exceptions, and it will be interesting to look at those exceptions in good time. But yeah, if you map the location of earthquake epicenters, it practically maps the plate boundaries for you. And just to cut to the chase, we can actually measure the positions of landmarks on the Earth's surface to within millimeters now using GPS. The same system that enabled us to drop cruise missiles right down Saddam Hussein's chimney, like some demented Santa Claus, means that we can measure the positions of continents with almost literally pinpoint accuracy. Your cell phone can't do this. It's not quite that good, but with somewhat more sophisticated receivers. Oh, look, it's computer animation. We can directly measure that plates are moving at speeds of between 2 and 15 centimeters a year, roughly the speed of your fingernail growth and the speed of your hair growth. That is on average how fast they're moving. And this is in line with estimates from the geologic record of how fast they've been moving over the past millions of years. So we can actually measure their movement in real time from one year to the next. Now, when you have plates that are together, when you're at a plate boundary, there's four things that can happen. One is that the plate boundary is still. There's a boundary, but there's no motion. The plates are just kind of right next to each other and they don't move. That's not real interesting. A second possibility is the plates are moving apart. A third is that they're moving together. And the fourth is that they're sliding past each other. Where they move apart, we get structures called mid-oceanic ridges. That's where two plates move apart. Where they move apart, molten rock comes up from below, solidifies, and forms new crust. Plates are literally growing along mid-oceanic ridges in a process called seafloor spreading. And then older crust gets pushed away to either side. That map right there, that is the Atlantic Ocean, and the colors show ages of seafloor. The oldest rocks on the floor of the North Atlantic are right up here, right next to, that's the North American coast. That's, New York is right there, and Washington, D.C. is right there, and Miami's down here. And then right here, you have very old crust on the African coast, right there, just off Morocco and Mali and Mauritania and all that. And that rock is roughly 150 million years old. The ages get younger as you go towards the middle of the Atlantic, and you can see there's a symmetry, right? If you were to go from here to here, you see the ages of the rocks make up this symmetrical pattern. And the youngest rocks on the Atlantic seafloor are the ones that are forming now, right at the center of the structure called the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. That is where molten rock is welling up from below and forming right there in the crack between the two plates. So seafloor is constantly getting made along these mid-oceanic ridges. There's no oceanic crust older than about 210 million years. The Ozarks average about twice that old. There's lots of rocks on the continents that are much older than 210 million years. But the fact that oceanic crust doesn't get older than that shows you that oceanic crust is constantly being created. We're making new oceanic crust today at these ridges. And old oceanic crust is constantly being destroyed. So if we're making new crust at these mid-oceanic ridges, and the Earth is not blowing up like a balloon, which it isn't, crust has to be destroyed, and it's destroyed at zones where one of these tectonic plates sinks under another, a process that we call subduction. Now, this can lead to the formation of certain mountain ranges, like the Cascade Mountains in the Pacific Northwest. And the technical term for mountain building in geology is orogeny. And so you used to be able to buy t-shirts at geology meetings with slogans like subduction leads to orogeny, which sounds rather zippy, but just means that one plate sinking under another leads to the formation of mountain ranges. This is what passes for geology humor, I might add. So at subduction zones, one plate sinks under another and eventually oozes back into the mantle, where over really, really long time periods, it might eventually get recycled in the form of new crust. And wherever you see a subduction zone, that's marked by a trench, and then behind the subduction zone, a chain of volcanoes called an island arc. Hawaii is not an island arc. This is important. Hawaii isn't an island arc, but the Aleutian Islands are an arc. The Philippines, Japan, Indonesia, the Lesser Antilles of the Caribbean, those are all island arcs. This is what a subduction zone looks like in cross section. There's one plate that is moving this way, and as it comes into contact with another plate, the first thing that happens is that sediment on the old plate gets scraped off the old plate and stuck onto the new plate, creating a subduction complex like the bedrock of San Francisco. San Francisco itself is built mostly on old deep sea sediments that got scraped off a plate that has now disappeared, called the Farallon plate, and glued onto North America, and getting kind of smushed as it did so. And then as this plate continues to sink, rock begins to melt in the asthenosphere, and melted rock begins rising to the surface, and it forms a chain of volcanoes. And the chain of volcanoes runs parallel to this trench that you get at the point where the subducting plate begins to get pushed down. So at subduction zones, you get a trench, and then back of that trench, you get a volcanic arc. We can actually see this because seismic waves, that's the shaking waves that result from earthquakes, travel faster in cold rock than in hot rock. So by measuring very carefully the positions of a lot of earthquakes and carefully recording their travel times, you can actually take a kind of ultrasound image of the interior of the Earth. And what you're looking at here is a virtual reconstruction of a cross section through the South Pacific. This is the edge of the Pacific plate. It's literally getting shoved down this way. You see it's colored in blue because it's relatively cold rock, and it's getting shoved down to a depth of 600, 700 kilometers before it finally starts blending in with the much hotter rocks that make up the mantle. And then up here, incidentally, we have a zone where liquid rock, okay, the Tonga arc is where liquid rock is coming up and creating an island arc, which includes the country of Tonga. This is where that subducting plate is melting, and some of it is pushing its way up and creating a chain of islands. So you can actually see in cross section what this process would look like. This is the edge of a subducting plate. There's a map of the Aleutian Islands. The city of Anchorage is right there. This right here is the Kamchatka Peninsula of Russia. There actually is a place where you can see Russia from Alaska. It's actually up here. It's a couple of little islands called the Diomedes. This right here, I believe, is the Katmai Peninsula. And all of these little fiddly islands all the way out to here are the Aleutian Islands. If anybody's ever watched The Deadliest Catch, the ships in The Deadliest Catch are all working out of the port of Dutch Harbor, which I think might be here on the island of Unalaska. I could be wrong about that. But all of the Aleutians are volcanic. There are eruptions, every couple of years or so. I didn't think to check before this lecture, but there's probably several volcanoes in the Aleutians that are rumbling and smoking even now. Every so often they have to evacuate one of them. South of the Aleutians, we have the Pacific Plate, and it's moving to the northwest. And this zone right here is the Aleutian Trench. That is where the Pacific Plate, moving in this direction, is forced to sink underneath the North American plate. So there's the Aleutian Trench. And then on the far side of the Aleutian Trench, we have this chain of volcanoes called the Aleutian Islands. So the Aleutian Islands are a classic example of an island arc. And by the way, they make an arc on a flat map because the Earth is round. I don't care what YouTube says. They make an arc for the same reason that if you take a knife blade and you make a very slanting, shallow cut into an orange, that will also make an arc. The fact that they're arc-shaped is just a consequence of the fact that the Earth is a sphere, or close enough as to make no difference. Okay. The third possibility is plates can move side to side. At mid-oceanic ridges, plates are moving away from each other. At subduction zones, plates are moving towards each other. I should mention that at certain types of mountain ranges, plates are also moving towards each other. If two continents crash into each other, both of the rocks will tend to buckle, and you end up with a mountain range made up of a bunch of very bent and folded and fractured rock, not unlike the Ouachitas. Hell, not unlike the bedrock around Conway. If you ever drive out Hogan Road, getting from West Conway to Highway 64, like you're going to Plummerville, if for some reason you should do that, you'll go through that ridge that they blasted about 20 years ago. You'll go through the Cadron Ridge road cut, right where Hogan meets 64. Actually, you can see this now that they've built that bypass from the interstate to Salem in Conway. And if you look at the rock layers there, you can see that they're all tilted at about a 45-degree angle. That results from a time when Pangea was forming, when North America crashed into South America and Africa, creating a mountain range that might have once been the size of the Himalayas. You're living on the eroded remnants of what could once have been, for all I know, the highest mountain range in the world. That's another one of the things that can happen when plates come together. The Himalayas today are a great example. So are the Ural Mountains in Russia. So are the Appalachians. So that's what happens when plates move apart or together. When plates slide, good job, Aaron. Good job. When plates slide past each other, we have what's called a transform boundary or a transform fault. And those always connect other types of plate boundaries. They'll connect two mid-oceanic ridges or two subduction zones, or sometimes a mid-oceanic ridge with a subduction zone. Far and away the best known transform fault. Most of them are underwater and not easy to see, but this is an aerial photo of the San Andreas Fault in Central California, which is probably the most famous of them. There's a map of the San Andreas Fault. There are mid-oceanic ridges down here in the Gulf of California, and there's mid-oceanic ridges up here marking the boundary between the Pacific Plate and a small plate called the Juan de Fuca Plate, named after the Spanish navigator who discovered Puget Sound, which is this thing right here where Seattle, Washington is located.
It makes sense since the Ring of Spire's edges is right there.
Yes, it does. All right.
That has to do with tectonic plates.
I should mention that this subduction zone right here between this little microplate called the Juan de Fuca Plate and the North American Plate is what causes volcanic activity, including Mount St. Helens and Mount Rainier and a bunch of other volcanoes making up the Cascade Range, going all the way down to Lassen Peak in Northern California. So there's a subduction zone right off the Pacific Northwest. And in this case, the volcanoes don't make islands. They make a mountain range. Anyway, I digress. That's the San Andreas Fault. It's where we have this big transform fault that connects the spreading zones down here with the spreading zones up here. California is not going to fall off and sink into the ocean. It is, however, getting dragged northwards because this side of the San Andreas Fault is going northwest relative to the North American plate, which compared to the Pacific is moving southeast. So San Francisco is going to get dragged northward and probably eventually join with Portland, which sounds about right. Incidentally, right here, one of the problems of living on the San Andreas Fault is the movement is not very smooth because the San Andreas has this bend in it. And wherever you have a transform fault where land on one side is trying to move in one direction, but there's a bend in it that's stopping free movement, you get a great deal of compression on the rock and you get mountain ranges. So all the mountains north of Los Angeles, the San Gabriel Mountains and others result from the fact that the San Andreas Fault can't move smoothly because it's got a kink. Incidentally, I used to live right about there on actually more like there, on a branch of the San Andreas called the Hayward Fault. A branch of the San Andreas runs right under the University of California, Berkeley's football stadium. Fortunately, the big earthquake didn't hit while I lived out there. If it had, we might not be having this conversation. Right. So that's what a transform boundary looks like. Last thing, and I promise we'll get to biology by the end of this. I mentioned that the plates are moving on top of this very dense, solid but gooey rock layer called the asthenosphere, or the upper mantle. There just happen to be spots in the asthenosphere that happen to be hotter than other spots. I used to demonstrate this by taking a sheet of paper and slowly moving it over a flame. This tends not to work because I set one too many fires in the classroom. But if you do this and you move the paper fast enough so that it chars, you'll notice that if you hold the flame steady and move the paper over the flame, you'll get a chain of charred markings on the paper. Well, as a continent moves on top of a hotspot, it forms a chain of volcanoes. This can look like a volcanic arc, but there's some major differences. For reasons we don't have time to get into, hotspot volcanoes tend to be much less dangerous. Island arc volcanoes associated with subduction, those are the killers. Those are the ones that tend to build up pressure for years and then explode. Krakatoa was an island arc volcano. The one that went off in 1883 that destroyed an entire island, created a tsunami that killed 30,000 people, and the sound of the explosion was heard 3,000 miles away. Still a record for the loudest natural sound. Anyway, subduction-related volcanoes tend to be like that. Those are the ones that tend to explode without warning. Those will kill you. Arc volcanoes are bad. Hotspot volcanoes tend to be milder. They form a chain. The chain of volcanoes is parallel to the direction that the continent's moving. And the other big difference is that at any given moment, the new volcanoes are on top of the hotspot. The older volcanoes are being carried farther and farther away, like they were on a conveyor belt. Whereas on a subduction-related arc, all of those volcanoes form at roughly the same time. All of the Aleutian Islands are active or potentially active. All of them formed at roughly the same time, but hotspot volcanoes form in a progression as one volcano forms on top of a hotspot and then is carried off the hotspot and a new volcano forms. So that's the best diagram I've been able to find. There's a zone in the asthenosphere where liquid rock forms, magma, and it's punching its way up through the Pacific plate and fueling the eruption of the Hawaiian volcanoes, notably the volcano Kilauea, which has been erupting pretty steadily ever since like 1981. Kilauea has actually added a couple of acres to the big island of Hawaii, where some of those lava flows have reached the sea. So the big island, I should mention, Hawaii is the name of the state, but the largest island in the state is also called Hawaii. To avoid confusion, people usually call the island the Big Island. So the Big Island right there is erupting now. The Pacific plate is moving in this direction, that way. And so the island of Maui has moved off the hotspot, and there's no longer much volcanic activity on Maui. There actually could be some residual activity, but Maui hasn't erupted since 1783. Oahu is where Honolulu is, and Pearl Harbor and all of that. That's farther away, and that hasn't erupted for the past 2 million years. The oldest of the islands in the state, Kauai, has not erupted for 6 million years or so. So there's this age progression between islands that have long been carried off the hot spot and haven't erupted for millions of years to the islands that are still forming right now. And that's because Hawaii is a hotspot chain. In fact, the state of Hawaii is right here. This is a satellite view that's been colorized. That's why the colors look kind of psychedelic, of the North Pacific. And the state is right there. But beyond the state of Hawaii, there's a whole bunch of tiny islands, and some of them have eroded below the surface of the ocean. So they're not islands anymore. They're called seamounts. They're called the Leeward Islands, going out all the way to Midway Island right here, famous for a big battle of World War II. And then continuing all the way up here along a chain of islands that have eroded so far that they're not islands anymore. They're basically undersea mountains called the Emperor Seamounts. Incidentally, the US claims most of these islands, and I don't say this very often, but I really appreciate George W. Bush creating the waters around these islands as the largest national monument, the largest unit by far in the US National Park System, protecting a lot of critical marine habitat. I'm generally all for that sort of thing. And trust me, coral reefs and coral islands these days need all the protection they can get. Anyway, that's because the Pacific plate has been moving over the hotspot for something like 65 million years. And every one of these little specks of land, all the way from the earliest empire seamounts, formed on top of that hotspot, used to be islands, and then moved off the hotspot and have eroded away. We think that dogleg results from the Pacific plate changing direction. Actually, there's been some debate as to that. Let's not get into that. And so the youngest Hawaiian islands are right on top of the hotspot. Kilauea is right there, and that's erupting now. The older volcanoes on Hawaii right there, oldest began erupting about 700,000 years ago. Maui last erupted in 1783. Actually, all four of these islands, we think, used to form a large island like the Big Island of Hawaii, but that has since sunk and been divided into separate islands here. And then those began erupting about 1.8 million years ago. Oahu right here between 3.3 and 2.3 million years old. Kauai dates between about 5.6 and 3.8 million years old. So the youngest Hawaiian islands, the ones that are still erupting, are on top of that hot spot. As the plate moves in this direction, islands get carried off the hot spot. So the farther away you go from the hot spot, the older the islands get. And by the way, in answer to the question that you no doubt wanted to ask, right about here is the next Hawaiian volcano. It hasn't broken the surface of the ocean yet, and it may not for, I forget, maybe thousands of years, probably more than that. It certainly won't happen in our lifetimes, but there is an underwater volcano forming right where you'd predict. It's called Loihi, and we've actually sent probes down to investigate it. So the newest Hawaiian volcano is forming now right where it should. Now we can finally get into biology. And I mentioned that Hawaii is home of a couple of the world's great species flocks. They're flies in the genus Drosophila. And you know Drosophila melanogaster all too well. That's the common fruit fly, one of the great model systems for studying genetics. I don't know if they still do. The genetics class used to raise live fruit flies and do actual crosses in lab, which meant we always had some flying around the building. I'm not sure that's done now, but they used to. But right next to Drosophila melanogaster, these are two of about 700 of the endemic Drosophila species found only in Hawaii. And in fact, species are restricted to only certain islands, or in many cases, only to certain valleys on certain islands. It's a great case of adaptive radiation. These flies are sometimes called picture-winged flies because you can see they've got, like this one in particular, they've got these patterns of dark pigment and clear areas on their wings. In fact, here's a whole bunch of picture-winged fly wings right here. These are from different species, and you can see they're all different. So ridiculous diversity of fruit flies. And on the face of it, it's a pretty typical adaptive radiation. Somehow, maybe they got blown by a big wind. Maybe there were maggots that were somehow carried on driftwood or something like that. We may never know exactly. But somehow some fruit flies made it to the Hawaiian Islands and were able to settle down and, find a niche. And then once they were in the Hawaiian Islands, populations of fruit flies got isolated on different islands. And, since fruit flies aren't long distance flyers, they get isolated on different valleys within the same island, and they'd speciate. And this must have happened a lot because, as I've said, there's 700 Hawaiian fruit fly species. And it turns out that if you do cladistic analyses of Hawaiian Drosophila using DNA, the order of appearance of Hawaiian Drosophilas mirrors the order of appearance of the islands. The earliest branch on this cladogram is a branch native to Oahu, which is one of the older islands. And then the next branch is native to Molokai and Maui, which are in between in age. And then the most recent branches are all on the Big Island. They're all on the Big Island of Hawaii right there. In fact, I've got more recent data. This came from a more thorough analysis a few years ago. And they confirmed the pattern that if you sample a lot of Drosophila, the overwhelmingly most common pattern is that lineages appear on older islands and then disperse to newer islands, from Kauai to Oahu to Maui to the Big Island. Those are cases where you have older branches on one island and then the younger branches on the next island. So there's 10 cases where we have an older branch on Oahu and its closest younger relative is over here on Maui. There's a few cases of dispersal that jumps the line and a few that have gone backwards. Like this is a case where we have species native to Maui that seem to have dispersed back to Kauai. And there's a few cases where Kauai flies seem to have jumped over Oahu to Maui and even to the Big Island. But the overwhelmingly most common pattern has been dispersal from older to younger islands. So whenever fruit flies got there, they would have lived on the older islands and then progressively dispersed to the younger islands as the younger islands were forming, jumping down that conveyor belt as the conveyor belt carries the older islands away and creates new islands. Whoa. And this happens again and again. That's a cladistic analysis from about 20 years ago of Hawaiian crickets. And the oldest branches of the cladogram are all on the oldest island. And then it looks like some of these Kauai crickets were able to disperse to Oahu, which is in the middle. And then some of those Oahu crickets made it to Maui. And some of those Maui, well, the details are a little bit hard to figure out, but the very latest branches seem to be on the Big Island. And again, that's what we would expect. So it happened with fruit flies, it happened with crickets. It happened with Hawaiian spiders. In the genus Tetragnatha, the oldest branches on two different spider lineages are found in Oahu, and then the next oldest are on, the oldest are on Kauai, the next oldest on Oahu, the ones after that are on Maui and surrounding islands, and then the youngest branches are on the Big Island. And then it happened again with a Hawaiian group of plants called silver swords, where the oldest branches are on Kauai and the medium branches are on Maui and the youngest branches are on the Big Island. It's happened over and over again. So that's where we can start taking patterns that we see in plate tectonics and comparing them to evolutionary patterns. And very often they turn out to be consistent with each other, telling the same story. And so we can learn about not just that speciation has happened, but how it's happened and what's been driving it by looking at plate tectonics. And we'll do some more of that this Thursday. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.